I am not a soil scientist. I am a forest geneticist by education, and in my evening and weekend job, I do research on adaptation, specifically of larch. My day job is titled Chief of National Forests for the Icelandic Forest Service, which means that I am a manager of forest managers. But I worked for the Icelandic Soil Conservation Service for a time, some years ago, so I know a little bit about soil as well. In Iceland, we have huge soil erosion problems. This photo wasn't taken in Iceland, it was taken on Mars. This is Iceland. Not very much different. A root of the problem is that we sometimes have volcanic eruptions in Iceland. And oftentimes they are under glaciers, and they leave, that forms a lot of tephra, which sometimes lands on the glaciers and sometimes lands outside the glaciers. But either way, it is kept there because the glaciers, when they melt, the tephra doesn't melt, so it's released eventually into the environment. And then it starts blowing around. And this is, of course, the mineral basis of our soils. We have andosols in Iceland, which are largely composed of this volcanic tephra. But the outcome of the blowing around, the physical blowing around of the tephra, is desertified land. It blows from the glaciers, from the volcanoes. It accumulates where there is vegetation, sometimes in large amounts so that the vegetation is covered, then it is destroyed, and then the tephra and the soil that used to be under the vegetation blows on in the next storm. And this is the outcome. This is one of our problems. Another main problem in soil erosion in Iceland is what are called erosion spots. These are caused by a complex unfortunate series of events. The first one being deforestation after settlement of Iceland, then followed by 1,000 years of sheep grazing, a winter that is not steady. We have, of course, not only a northern climate, but also a maritime climate, which means that our winters are actually fairly mild. There isn't a continuous snow cover, at least not in the lowlands. So we get warm and cold spells all winter long, which means a freeze-thaw cycle. The soil freezes and thaws again and again, expanding and contracting. And this causes rifts in the vegetation cover, especially when it's not covered by forest. Also, grazing can cause these bare spots, also blowing snow. But because of the freeze-thaw cycles, the bare spots tend to get larger and larger with time, at least in the presence of grazing. After a while, we have larger areas without continuous vegetation than with continuous vegetation, and then these escarpments form between the discontinuous and continuous vegetation areas. Those of you who have been to Iceland know that this is one of the main features of the Icelandic landscape. And when they blow away finally, the result is desertified land again. Another problem we have has to do with the same freeze-thaw cycles in winter along with gravity on slopes. When the soil freezes and thaws again and is wet, it kind of tends to leak down the slope. And this phenomenon, again, in the absence of forests and the presence of sheep grazing specifically, leads to denuded hillsides over hundreds of years. These are maps from Ólafur Arnalds, who along with his team in the 1990s, mapped the erosion problems of Iceland. These are erosion areas mostly connected with barren lands, in other words, lands without continuous vegetation. They're largely in the interior, and you can see that they are perhaps connected to the glaciers in the volcanic area that goes through the center of Iceland. The sand blows in storms. The sand, the tephra, the soil, it blows in storms. Because we're an island, the side that gets the wind is wet, and the lee side away from the wind is dry. And since there is no predominant wind direction in Iceland, we can get dry periods in all parts of Iceland, and then the tephra starts to blow. The erosion spots are associated with mostly vegetated land, but as you can see, this problem is very, very widespread. And it is everywhere where we have grazing pastures for sheep. And on the edges of these are the escarpments. These are areas with high concentrations of escarpments. Not as widespread, but these are active erosion fronts. So these are areas where there's very active erosion going on. And then downslope creep is everywhere where we have mountains, mostly in the northwest and the east of Iceland, or where we have mountainous areas where this is a big problem. Taken together, about 66% of Iceland suffers from moderate to severe erosion problems. Of course, we have other erosion problems as well, the ones you are more familiar with: landslides, stream bank erosion. The picture on the far right is actually a footpath, or used to be a footpath, that has where the vegetation was trampled and water erosion took over. We have these, but they are much more limited in area than the large erosion problems that we have. The root causes of these huge erosion problems in Iceland are historical. Iceland was settled about 1140 years ago. At that time, the lowlands were mostly birch forest or woodlands. The highlands were a willow tundra up to a variable elevation, but probably somewhere between 600 and 900 meters usually, depending on where in the highlands you were. And above that was non-continuous vegetation or an Arctic desert, where the climate is so cold, the summers are so short that it doesn't support a continuous vegetation. And of course, the settlers to Iceland began by doing things that the settlers everywhere where they come to a new place do. They cleared the forest to create pastures, hayfields, grazing land for their livestock. And the livestock grazing prevented regeneration of the forest. We had only one forest-forming tree species in Iceland, downy birch, or Betula pubescens. And it is very palatable to sheep, especially, and cattle, of course. But the cutting down of the wood didn't really deforest Iceland. It was the prevention of regeneration by sheep grazing that caused the ultimate deforestation. And of course, once that had happened and grazing continued, the spot erosion and the downslope creep started. And sand was released. Sandy areas, tephra areas that had been wooded before, when they are deforested, become unstable and the tephra starts to blow again. The highland tundra seemed to have no grazing tolerance at all. We have almost none of that left in Iceland now. And the erosion at the boundary between continuous and non-continuous vegetation seems to have started immediately. We know this because we have a very handy tephra layer in Iceland called the landnám layer, the settlement layer, which we can find all over Iceland. Apparently a volcano erupted about a year before the first settlers came to Iceland. And it erupted for a long time and spread this ash layer all over Iceland. Usually the ash only falls downwind from the volcano. But this volcano erupted for such a long time that the wind had time to change directions all around. So it's found all over Iceland, and this is how we know in the soil when settlement happened. And here you can see a soil section. It's a little over a meter thick. The darker area in the bottom represents buildup of soil over about 9,000 years from the deglaciation until settlement. The upper or lighter part, the lighter soil, represents 1,000 years of deposition. Mostly aeolian deposition from erosion from the highlands, deposited in vegetated areas in the lowlands. And right away, right at settlement, we see an increase in the speed of soil thickening because of this increased deposition from the erosion in the highlands. In a deforested landscape, there is little to capture blowing sand or soil or tephra. There is little protection from ground vegetation from the freeze-thaw cycles, and there is little to anchor the soils on the hillsides. The obvious solution: more forests. In 1907, the Iceland Forest Service was established with the remit to protect the last remnants of birch woodlands and to start afforestation with a variety of goals. Wood production is, of course, something that everyone thinks of in forestry, but largely to begin with, afforestation was done in Iceland for reclamation of degraded and eroded land. By degraded land, I mean grazing land, land that has been modified by sheep grazing for 1,000 years and has become largely heathland with erosion spots. And of course, especially around towns and villages for amenity, for recreation, and so on. The soil conservation part split from the Forest Service in 1916 due to politics, the politics of the parliament, largely occupied by farmers at the time. But the Soil Conservation Service has largely been operated to try to control encroaching sand, mostly using lime grass, or Laemus arenarius, revegetation of eroded land also, and to try to improve land for grazing. In other words, land that is not protected from grazing, to try to improve it. But these two sister organizations have functioned side by side since 1916, one of them trying to put out the fires, the other one not having to worry about that, and we can play with trees. Forestry today is mostly done on farms through a grant scheme, largely for timber production, but also and mostly it takes place on degraded land, in other words, grazing land, but not necessarily eroded land. Also, we do forestry on fertile sites for production purposes. We have a project called Land Reclamation Forests, which is about a fifth to a fourth of our afforestation effort, and along with Hekla forests, which is an area around the volcano Hekla. These are our afforestation projects specifically aimed at afforesting eroded land and to stop soil erosion and build up soil again. The Soil Conservation Service today is still seeding lime grass in sand dune areas. They also support farmers to stop erosion and improve their grazing land, mostly through sowing grass plus fertilizer or simply using fertilizer. They are also very much involved in erosion of desertified areas. The Nootka lupin, which is an exotic species, was used to a great extent until just a few years ago. But the principles of ecosystem restoration, not using exotics, has become more popular with them now. So, we have over a century of experience and research results. We have several methods and species that work well and are suitable under various conditions. Most of these require exclusion of livestock to be effective. The methods are variably expensive, they're variably quick, they're variably long-lasting. The choice of method depends on conditions and desired results, whether it's stopping erosion in the most efficient way possible, which is needed in large areas, or stopping encroaching sand, which is on relatively smaller areas but a difficult problem, improving grazing land, ecosystem restoration, which usually means restoring the native woodlands, or productive forest. Exotic species are often more efficient, which means that they do the job cheaper, quicker, they're more productive, and often more long-lasting than the natives. This is a simple fact. There are cultural obstacles that we need to deal with. We are a small nation in a relatively big land. We heard from Anna this morning that there are about 300 people per square kilometer in Basque Country. We have 3 in Iceland. So we have fewer taxpayers per hectare than most other countries. This means that funding is always a constraint. Actually, if you compare Iceland to any other small European city with a population of 300,000, that's the population of Iceland, we actually plant more trees than any other small city in Europe. But a sustained political will is also needed. Since the financial crash of a few years ago, the Icelandic budget looks like this. The entire budget for forestry and soil conservation is not seen on this scale. We're repaying some debt incurred by a group of about 30 people before the financial crash. And then we are running the rest of the country, but soil conservation and afforestation are not big priorities, unfortunately. We also have traditional obstacles. There's a tradition of free-range sheep grazing, which means the sheep are basically released from the home fields in early summer, and they range all over Iceland, everywhere that is not specifically fenced to exclude them. So any attempts at afforestation, any afforestation projects, any soil conservation projects that aim at ecosystem restoration, for example, have to start by putting up an expensive fence. And this culture of sheep grazing, there is no will among the Icelandic, certainly not among the farmers who have the sheep, not among the Icelandic politicians who listen to the farmers more than they listen to us, and not among the Icelandic public in general. There's no movement to change this way of having sheep farming. Also, people are conservative. Many people don't like change. Then there's the current fashion in nature conservation to be against exotic species. Exotics are suspect. Sometimes some people say exotics are bad. And this picture is taken of my home, which is disappearing. Everything about this picture is bad. The lupin is exotic, the lodgepole pine is exotic, the larch is exotic. My house is disappearing into the forest, which means that the view is no longer there for to sell to the tourists. They come from countries where there are forests, so they don't come to Iceland to see forests. We have sold the denuded landscape to tourists. And there are not only the sheep farmers who are stakeholders in maintaining the same land use, but now there's the whole tourism industry that is a stakeholder in this, and they want to maintain the open landscape where you can see everywhere. That means no trees. The result is that protection of woodlands, afforestation, and soil conservation are practiced within fenced patches here and there. The locations of these areas do not necessarily reflect the greatest need. Soil erosion is ongoing over most of Iceland, and Iceland remains almost completely deforested. This situation is actively maintained through tradition, through agricultural grants, and tax breaks to promote tourism. A few words about forestry, finally. We have recently started using big machines in Icelandic forestry, and there are occasional problems. But compared to the erosion problems at large, these are small, and these are easily dealt with. When we have to take timber out of the forests when it's wet and it causes a little bit of erosion, this is something that's fairly easy to fix, mostly because it's within an area that's already fenced to keep out the sheep. Afforestation most often leads to improvement of soil nutrient status because the land available for afforestation is degraded to begin with. Increased afforestation is much more a solution to soil erosion than a problem. And with this final photo of what used to be a gravel pit, I say thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have one question for you about the Basque influence on land use in Iceland.
The Basque
History,
influence.
the Basque influence.
Basque influence. Yes, we have a shared history in Iceland with the Basques. The Basque whalers came to Iceland for, probably 200 or 300 years. And they they didn't leave any sheep in Iceland, but they did leave some genes. We have some dark-haired Icelanders running around. But there are many stories I could tell, but I don't think there's time.